Hello. It's a very long time since I retired, and I was a professor of social policy, and I'm not a historian, but this was a retirement project for me. I now live in Sandwich, and I'd always known since I first came here in 1973 to a lectureship at the University of Kent that something had happened in Sandwich, which was of interest to me personally because I'm the daughter and granddaughter of German Jewish refugees. And when I first came here in 1973, everybody said, oh, you must go and visit Sandwich. It's a really nice place. So I took myself off there, and I noticed this plaque, which is on the Barbican Gate. I haven't got a photo, I'm afraid, of the Barbican Gate, but it's that lovely gate with the curved gable ends at one end of the toll bridge, what we call the toll bridge. It's a swing bridge over the Stour, if any of you know Sandwich at all. It's difficult to read because there's a lot of traffic that goes through the arch, but this is what that plaque says. This plaque is to commemorate the Richborough Transit Camp 1939 to 40, where 5,000 men found refuge from Nazi persecution on the continent. During the Second World War, most of them volunteered to fight for the Allied cause, erected in gratitude to the citizens of Sandwich and East Kent, who, as in the past, welcomed the refugees. What I didn't know in 1973 was that that plaque had only just been put up, funded by the Association of Jewish Refugees. I also didn't know what it was about, because if you're brought up in a refugee household, you do hear stuff. We didn't call it the Holocaust at the time, but you know something awful had happened, which explained why your family was tiny. You also heard terms like Auschwitz and Belsen and concentration camps. But I'd never heard of the Richborough Transit Camp, and certainly not that 5,000 men found refuge from Nazi persecution on the continent. The other curious thing about this plaque is it doesn't mention that they were Jews at all. The word Jew isn't there. That struck me as rather strange, because I thought, well, it can't be 5,000 social democrats or 5,000 homosexuals. It must be 5,000 Jewish men. And why was it men? Why doesn't it mention women? And so in 1973, I was very intrigued by this, but realized that I was here to teach social policy and I wasn't a historian, and this wasn't something that I should spend any time thinking about at all. But later, when I went to the University of Southampton, there's a very large world-class archive there, established by an Anglican vicar in the 1920s called James Parks. And he was particularly interested in Jewish-Christian relations, and he collected a whole lot of stuff, which he left to the University of Southampton, and they have developed that. And I discovered that there was stuff in that archive that was clearly about this. And it wasn't known as the Richborough Transit Camp, although that's what the plaque says. It was known as the Kitchener Camp. And the Kitchener Camp was an old First World War camp. In fact, Sandwich in the First World War and also in the Second World War was very important as a port, known as Richborough. Richborough, as you probably know, is a Roman fort very close to Sandwich, which if you haven't been there, I really strongly recommend that you go. It's a really extraordinary site. There were 7 First World War camps, which were part of the Richborough area, and one of them was called the Kitchener Camp, after Lord Kitchener, who was the commander of British forces until he was drowned in 1916. So when I came to live in Sandwich, which was just coincidence, I wanted to come back to East Kent. We found a house in Sandwich and we settled there. The first thing I did when I got there was I went to the Guildhall, the Sandwich Guildhall archives, and began to find stuff about the Kitchener camp, including a bound volume of 6 issues of the camp magazine known as the Kitchener Camp Review. I now know that there were 3 others in addition to those 6, and they're all collected together in the Wiener Library in London. I also found the start of a diary, obviously written by somebody who was running the camp, somebody called Phineas May. And the Kitchener Camp Review was edited by somebody called Jonas May. So I began to get a sense of there's something interesting here. Anyway, off I went to the Imperial War Museum, the Wiener Library, and I found a whole lot more. And then in the end, I realized I had to go to Jerusalem, which was another story in my own biography, because being Jewish, obviously, I had been to Israel before, but for the first time, I thought, I'm not going just to Jerusalem, I'm also going to the West Bank because I want to see what's going on there. And it was a revelation, but I'm not going to talk about that at all. It doesn't surprise me that you didn't know about this, because very few people do, although it was very important. In fact, I discovered very quickly that there weren't 5,000 men saved, there were 4,000. And the title of my book is 4,000 Lives, and I've put some copies there. So there were 10,000 children, unaccompanied children, brought here by the Kindertransports, the transports of children from Berlin and Vienna. And we know a lot about the Kindertransports, and it features in the curriculum of secondary schools when they look at the Holocaust and so on. What I very quickly discovered was that there were, in fact, 2 rescues, both run by the Central British Fund for German Jewry, which was a committee that was entirely men, and they were Jews from Jewish families that had settled here from the 18th century onwards. So they were Montefiore's, they were Davidoff Goldschmidts, they were Rothschilds, they were rich Jews who'd got old money, but there were also new Jews, so Simon Marx from Marks and Spencer's and so on, and Oscar Deutsch from the Odeon cinema chain. So they were very concerned about getting people out of Germany. And they set up these 2 rescues, the Kindertransports and the rescue to the Kitchener camp, which they rented in Sandwich. And they were run in parallel and run very similarly, and triggered initially by Kristallnacht, that's the great pogrom of November the 9th and 10th, 1938, when synagogues were burnt and Jewish shops destroyed, and 30,000 men, and that's the interesting thing, men were arrested and taken to 3 concentration camps, Dachau, Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. And the children came on trains from Berlin and Vienna, and the children came via the Hook of Holland to Harwich, which is why and then got on a train to Liverpool Street, and that's why there's a wonderful statue outside Liverpool Street Station of these children with labels and little suitcases. These men came on a slightly different route. They came on the whole on trains to Ostend and then to Dover on a ferry. So I've mentioned the Central British Fund for German Jewry. They basically took a huge risk and decided to do this and get these children and these men out of Greater Germany. They managed to persuade their equivalents in the United States to fund 20% of the cost of the first year of running the Kitchener camp. And they managed to persuade the Home Office to allow them to do this. Now, often I feel that the media treatment of the Kindertransports often seems to hint that actually this was a British government exercise. It wasn't at all. The British government paid, there was no funding at all from the British government, either for the Kindertransports or for this rescue. They simply gave permission for them to happen. And in this particular case, for the Kitchener camp rescue, the Home Office said that the men had to be in transit. They had to be able to demonstrate that they would leave this country within about a year. And the way that they could do that was if they were top of or very close to the top of the American, the United States visa system, if they had permission to go to Palestine, and because of the Arab revolt in 1936 in Palestine, the British government who were running the mandate at the time, had very carefully restricted the numbers of Jews who could migrate to Palestine. Or they had what the men endearingly called ship tickets, which was a paid-for ticket to leave a British port to go anywhere else in the world. And Shanghai was one of the places that they had tickets for. So they had to be in transit. They were not allowed to work, just like the asylum seekers now in this country. It's a long tradition of forbidding people coming here from working. And it started as a refugee camp in February 1939. The first refugee arrived from Berlin on February the 8th, 1939. And it continued as a refugee camp until May 1940. And the Central British Fund decided it should be for what they called young men, aged 17 to 45. And the reason they picked 17 was because the oldest age for the Kindertransports was 16. So they did see these two rescues as absolutely complementary to each other and run in the same way. And they also said it should be for men, because it was men who had been taken to these 3 concentration camps up after Kristallnacht. They had to, the men who were to come had to demonstrate urgency, and that meant that many of them had been arrested, taken to concentration camps. At that time, concentration camps were not industrial killing sites, as they became after 1942. They were prison camps run with very, very small numbers of staff, but they were outside the conventional prison system. They were extremely brutal regimes, and it's now estimated that during this period about 15% of the prisoners in these camps died. But you could leave if you could demonstrate that you would leave Greater Germany, and by Greater Germany I mean Germany and Austria, within about a week, 10 days. So you could go, and so long as you had the capacity to leave the country, and permission to come to the Kitchener camp was obviously a satisfactory permission. So the men were selected, and they were selected by the Jewish agencies in Berlin and Vienna. The pressure in Vienna was very, very considerable, because Adolf Eichmann, who was later arrested and executed in 1961 for war crimes, he was in charge of the ethnic cleansing system and based in Vienna. He put pressure on, and he moved the Jewish agency into the Rothschild Palace, which is where Eichmann was working in Vienna. And he moved them into the Rothschild Palace so that he could oversee and tell them every week, so how many have you got rid of? And he used pretty brutal methods to make these Jewish men select Jews as quickly as possible to leave Germany. The camp was derelict. It was an old First World War camp which hadn't been occupied since the end of the First World War, 22 years. So it was falling down. So the men were chosen largely because they had skills appropriate to put that camp to rights. So they were not the conventional German Jewish refugee. They were not the professional lawyers, the doctors, the successful business people that did manage to get here using personal means, because they knew people here already, which is how my own family came. They knew people here already, but they were skilled artisans. They were plumbers and roofers, and oh gosh, I've got 5 minutes. Okay. Anyway, so I often have to tell people about Sandwich, but I'm rather hoping that you all know about Sandwich. And it's a very exquisite little place, and a very surprising place to have 4,000 Jewish men living on the edge of it in 1939-40. And not much happens in Sandwich, and it was a rather depressed little market town. But in the summer, and this is still the case, it expanded with these really posh upper class British people. Waldorf and Nancy Astor. Nancy Astor was the first woman MP to take her seat. Harold and Dorothy Macmillan. Harold Macmillan was the Prime Minister. The Prince of Wales and his mistress before Mrs. Simpson came on the scene. And a fascist called Captain Robert Gordon Canning, who lived on the Sandwich Bay estate. All these people had what they called their cottages on the Sandwich Bay estate, which were enormous and still are enormous mansions. There are also organised fascists in the town. Gordon Canning was a close friend of Oswald Mosley, who was the leader of the fascists. And Lady Grace Pearson was immensely rich and lived in the grandest house in Sandwich, but was also the parliamentary candidate for British Union of Fascists for Canterbury. And she spent a lot of time here. British fascism, incidentally, was different from German fascism in that it gave a place for women. And actually, there were a considerable number of quite prominent aristocratic women who were fascists and who made a successful career in British fascism. Why won't it move on? Oh, here we are. Just quickly, some pictures. It looks like a camp. It was a camp. It was not a comfortable place to live. This is Jonas, who was Jewish, who was the Kitchener camp director. He was given the job because there used to be a summer camp for the Jewish Lads Brigade at Kingsdown, near Deal. And in fact, on occasion, when I'm in a London taxi cab and the cabbie says, "So where are you from? Or where are you going?" And I say Sandwich, and the cabbie says, "Oh, I used to go down to Kingsdown to the Jewish Lads Brigade," because they look at me, they know I'm Jewish, and so they start chatting. And but Jonas had been running that camp, and so they thought he was suitable to run a camp for 4,000 adult traumatized men. And this is his brother Phineas in his Pioneer Corps uniform, and I'm not going to be able to talk about the Pioneer Corps and what that was and how the camp changed a bit. But Phineas kept a daily diary, and it's an absolutely wonderful piece of work. He wrote probably 20 minutes, half an hour every day during the lifetime of the camp, from February to September 1939. And it's an astonishing piece of work, and I do often think it should be published. The regime of the camp was to work to get these huts in decent order. There was business for Sandwich because they needed help from local business people, and that helped with public relations. It was a very good way of making certain that Sandwich also benefited from the presence of these men. It was a well-managed process that they were aware. They knew that there could be an upsurge in anti-Semitism, but they used business to make certain local business to make certain that people had an interest in the existence of this camp. It wasn't Dachau or Buchenwald, but it wasn't private. This is the camp waiting, a hut waiting for new arrivals. There was a camp flag, and of course, all these men would have experienced the exchange of their national flags, Germany and Austria, for the swastika. So to have a camp flag, which was a national flag, was an innovation for them. And they, in Phineas's diary, he has this wonderful piece about how he told them they had to sing God Save the King, which they did, and they all raised their hats and so on. There was a library. There were lots of slogans all over the place. Please keep quiet is just one of them. Another one was, England expects every man to do his duty. You are not Englishmen, but you must do your duty. So there was, it was hard work. And they couldn't take, the Orthodox Jews were not allowed to have Saturdays off, and there were 100 Christians, so-called non-Aryans, and they were not allowed to take Sundays off. So it was hard work. There were pastimes. I won't tell you the story of this rather plump man here, but I met his daughter when I was doing the research, and that was very interesting. There was a theatre in one of the really big huts. There were huge huts on the other side of the road, which were part of the so-called Hague camp, which they also rented started renting in July 1939. There was lots going on, and I always show this photo just to remind people that there were no no women in the camp, or at least not for most of the time. So they had to innovate. They went to the Ramsgate Carnival. There was lots of activity up and down the coast, partially because the Germans in Berlin, the Jewish agency said, if you've got a musical instrument, bring it. There was a list of things that they should bring, clothes and that kind of thing. But and a lot of them did bring musical instruments, and there was a camp orchestra, which was very good. And the BBC were going to broadcast a concert on September the 3rd, 1939, but they changed their minds, not surprising. Here they are. They obviously, some of them brought accordions. Why they got these +4s on, I don't know. I mean, presumably their mothers thought that's what a posh young Englishman wears. I have no idea. And on the side of this float, it says, "Our thanks to England." And this was again at the Ramsgate Carnival. So is this a happy story? When I started this work, I thought, why hasn't anybody written about this? Because it is a happy story, and we all want to read feel-good stuff. And it isn't. I mean, in many respects, it's not. There was huge trauma from the concentration camp experience. There was a lot of madness in the camp. I think there were at least 2 suicides. They'd left their families behind. Of course, that's a feature that doesn't really get talked about with the Kindertransports. Why didn't those children, why weren't their parents allowed to come? And exactly the same question can be asked of this group. Why couldn't they bring their families? And they couldn't. In Jerusalem, I found a list of 582 children, which had been drawn up in October 1939, after war had broken out. The idea was that these children could come, but the Home Office said no. And I then searched them, and I found about half of them on transports. Because you get on this list, it's very detailed, the full name of the child, their address, their last known address, their absolutely accurate age. And the Holocaust was extremely bureaucratized, as I'm sure you all know. Well, certainly after 1942. So you can find these people. And about half of these children, I know, went on transports. And you can also do a search for who with the same surname of about the age, what woman of about the age that those children's mothers would have been, went on the same transport, and you can find them. And in most cases, it's quite clear that the children that were transported went with their mothers. About 600 men were later from the Kitchener camp were later interned, but I won't tell you that story. The upside is that I interviewed a number of the old boys. They used to meet in, I always find it rather amusing that they met in the Imperial Cafe, which was run by Poles in the Golders Green Road every month for a reunion. And so I managed to talk to a number of them early on in the research. And they seem to have made reasonable new lives in this country. I visited a lot of them in their homes. Those that had left their families, their wives and children behind, most of them had made another marriage and had another family. But they didn't want to talk about Kitchener Camp at all. What they wanted to talk about was their contribution to the war effort, and in particular to the post-war war crimes process, because most of them, I think probably almost all of them, were involved in the denazification process and the war crimes process after the Second World War, and were taken back to Germany to be part of that. The relations with the people of Sandwich were generally good. There doesn't seem to have been an upsurge in local anti-Semitism, although the fascists tried very hard, and I describe in my book what they tried to do. And I wrote a book about it. There we go.